This video is sponsored by MyMiniFactory, and it is my Traveller RPG Spaceship and Severna Spaceport Diorama. This was a wildly overambitious project for the timescale that I had. It used a couple of new techniques that, quite frankly, one just didn't work. But you'll find out all about it in the video. So MyMiniFactory asked me to do a sponsored video for them around this Traveller Type S, which is currently crowdfunding. You can go and buy this ship now on MyMiniFactory. It's a beautiful design in 28mm FDM, has full working interior and landing gear. One of the options is Deck Designer, which enables you to put your ship together. It's not only instructions, but you can use it to customise the ship with some of the stretch goal options. This is the pitch video, and you can see this is actually 25 inches long. It's beautiful. Some of Ben's other designs are in the background there. Go check out this video, I'll put a link, but come straight back. Now, full confession, I don't play Traveller, but I wanted to do a diorama around it, and it's been heavily influenced by Mass Effect, Halo, Titanfall, my favourite games. I hit a problem straight away though. If that ship was 25 inches long, then this diorama is bigger than my mum. So I decided to use 15mm, the original Traveller scale. It meant sacrificing the whizzy interior, but I could put a working diorama around it. So with the scale decision made, it was time to get on building the ship. First of all, I put it into one big file, put it all together and sliced it in one go and just printed it in one big print. This was in a super fast resin because it's clear, but it still took 40 hours. Yes, 40 hours to print this. And as you can see, it's a monster. Even at the half the size, it's still 13 inches long. But doing it like this, I didn't have to assemble anything. All I had to do was clean it up and paint it. Perhaps put a little more detail behind that. I snipped it off its supports and then cleaned it in isopropyl alcohol. Thankfully, I have a very large homemade UV curing chamber. This is resin, it needs curing. It only needs a minute or two, but it's very large and it didn't all fit at once. Once it was cured, I cleaned off any of the support marks from the resin. I printed it deliberately supported from the nose because these are quite smooth panels, so they're easy just to sand flat. I'm painting it white and red, so I primed it with the white Tamiya primer. The primer made it easy to spot any areas that needed sanding or filling before spraying with a coat of white gloss Tamiya. I tested out paint scheme ideas in Photoshop first. I masked the areas I wanted to stay white, and then I painted the underneath red gloss Tamiya. I wasn't 100% happy with the colour though, so I went over it with a Vallejo black red. I painted the legs gunmetal from Tamiya. It's a nice dark metallic. Peeling off masking tape is so satisfying, especially if it hasn't leaked. Some things are just easy to hand paint though, like the inside of these landing gear hatches. I weathered the landing gear with some silver. So now I've got the base colours on, it's time to do the stripes. So the top is red over white, so I masked it out with Tamiya masking tape. So for the top I needed to use the same colours as the bottom, the red Tamiya gloss and then the dark red Vallejo over the top. However, I probably should have just painted them flat and then chipped with white later. I think I'd have got a better result. I'm applying this with a sponge chipping brush, so you get this kind of pattern, and I built it up. It took a lot of layers to cover the white. I still ended up glazing over the top with just a dilute red anyway to fill in all the gaps. I hand painted the cockpit area with the brighter Tamiya gloss red. Now I'm painting on a dark grey to show the primer underneath being worn away. So I went over every line, every edge with this dark grey. Then I added an edge highlight in silver. Now this is still scary bright. So I mixed up some terps and oil, just white oil paint, and put a wash all over everything to tone it down. And then I did exactly the same on the other side, except this time it's white over red. I like the look of the dark grey and silver over the red. It doesn't look as stark as it does on the white, but it still needed toning down with a whitewash. And one of the reasons for using an oil wash is you can come back with some clean terps and just take it off if you've put too much on, which, to be honest, with this amount of red was quite easy to do. Next up, I used MIG Dark Enamel Wash to bring out the little gaps that are actually there in the 3D print, all the panel lines. When I'm unsure, I let things sit for a while, so I glued in my landing gear and all of the hanging down hatches before assembling the turret, putting it in place and painting the windows with a Tamiya gloss black and then a colour shift golden rose. I put a little bit of engine oil, it's an AK Interactive gloss colour, onto my landing gear and then bit the bullet and went all over my white again. I just wasn't happy. It looked muddy on those gaps. It just didn't look right. So I hand painted the grey to a smaller finish and it just looked a lot better. Took a while, mind, and I had to add a wash of this white over the rest of the panels just to brighten them up a bit. They're just a tad dark now and dirty looking. So that was the ship finally done. Time, oh, that's not very exciting base. Yeah, it just looks boring. This is more what I'm after. Time to do a landing pad. So this started life as a sheet of PVC board, black, 3mm. To build it up and do the 45-degree slopes on the sides, I used black craft foam. It's like a dense insulation foam. I cut it on my new Proxon cutter and then I sealed it with black paint and PVA to make sure it was nice and solid. Heavily channeling Mass Effect, I wanted to edge the landing pad so people don't fall off it. I made some 3D little pipe holders. I used black straws and then just strips and strips of white styrene all glued together until I got these pipe holders and cut out a ramp for ground access. This landing pad has lights though, so I marked out where I wanted them to go. I raided my stash of LEDs for some white 3 and 5mm LEDs and some orange ones for the warning lights. That decided, I drilled out the holes for them to come through the landing pad top. The warning light, the LED wires just slip down between the landing pad and that pipe work. I marked the wire runs underneath and it was time to carve out the foam and start wiring. But first, I painted it with aged iron by Rust-Oleum, a brilliant tarmac effect. To help paint all the landing pad markings, I cut out some stencils on a Brother scan and cut machine. These proved to be a nightmare on the tarmac. They're fine everywhere else, but they stuck to themselves, they stuck to my fingers, they did not stick to the tarmac. Not one jot. Ugh. Finally, it was time to wire in all of those LEDs, so I stuck them in place. Now, I'm not going to show you my wiring on this. It was awful. I used quite a thick wire. It was stiff, it moved. I masking taped it in place. I'm going to show you the ramp. The ramp worked really well. But I wired this up and glued it on with some polyurethane glue and put bricks on it to weight it as it expands. But now the ramp, which I would recommend. I used copper tape. I'd actually used it on the control tower. I've done these out of order really. The ramp was done much, much later. And copper tape is adhesive, conductive tape made of copper. Really easy to use. So I stuck some down both sides of the LED holes. I bent over the leads of the LEDs. I popped them in place, added a dab of flux and added solder. Job done. So easy. And here's the finished lights. I'll make the orange ones flash later. I cut a wedge of foam to support the ramp, used copious amounts of hot glue and glued it all in place. More hot glue and the pipework was in place. To edge the sides, I cut up some old styrene sheets into 6x9 pieces. I then used a pattern notcher to cut out just some little detail on the side and a Tamiya scriber just to scribe some simple lines on in thirds so that they weren't just plain sheets. I designed a bunch of grills in Blender and printed them in resin just to edge the bottom to give it a little bit more detail. And for all of these, I spray painted them in white primer and then used a dark enamel MIG wash to bring out all of the details and to heavily weather them. I painted the top of the diorama white to just hide the gap between the pipework and these panels. And then I hot glued them in place. This allows for a little bit of differential on the foam not being quite straight where I cut it, or perhaps some warping on the panels. I trimmed pieces for the corners and the ramp before adding a couple of straws to hide the gap. The final weathering on the sides was a dirty glass wash by MIG Productions. I love this wash. I've used it on everything. It's great over white, it's perfect over black, works well over red and orange. Win, win, win. I just streaked it on very lightly. I just want a feeling of weathering. I don't want them to be too heavy. To weather the tarmac, I used tile grout. This is taupe by Larson. It's one of my favourite colours. And I just put it on. I put it really thickly around the edges to hide the gap where the LED wires go down. And so there's a slight gap between the pipe holder and the tarmac. The fact the stencils wouldn't stick to this top probably should have warned me, but I sprayed this with my normal mix of isopropyl alcohol and water, about a third isopropyl alcohol. Now, this normally will just dilute the tile grout a little bit and it will set nice and solid because it's got cement in it. It didn't. It went weird. It didn't look much better when dry. It's now very light. So I went over it with some brown. There's City Industrial Dirt. It's a MIG pigment. I just went around the edges and went over it. I didn't want it to be a really dark tarmac colour. I wanted it to be faded, but this was a little bit too much. Finally, I sprayed it again with the isopropyl alcohol and water mix. It's a pigment, it reacts slightly differently. And I cleaned off all the little bristles that had come out and my white lines. So with the landing pad done, it was time to turn my attention to some of the buildings. I wanted the landing pad to tie in though, so I used the same sort of panels that I'd made. I'd made about 59 of them. I should have made more. When I put the ramp in, I actually used some that were planned for the building, so I did run out. The building itself is just a 2mm styrene box, glued together, job done. I designed a control tower to stick out at the top and cut it on my brother's scan and cut. You ideally need less than 1/4 mil styrene for it to cut through, so I glued multiple layers together to get what I wanted. I designed and 3D printed a door. It's a smaller version of the cargo doors on the outside of the building, and then these display panels which I can light doing clear resin. I glued it all together using squares to keep it nice and straight, and then just painted it black. I masked off the centre panel of the circular back pieces and sprayed everything white. The top's removable so you can get in, but I took the opportunity to add a stencil. This time it actually stuck. I dab it on so it doesn't go under the stencil. I still don't think it's that secure. And it's a white, heavy body, just artist acrylic. It's a little bit more dense so you don't need to put so many coats on. I'm trying to keep the colour palette quite streamlined. So I've got reds and oranges, greys and whites and blacks. And that's it. I've used quite a bluey grey though, because it just tones well with the orange. So for the interior panels, etc., I peeled off the masking tape. I decided that I would also let the buttons shine, so I just used an emery board to take the top off and then just put a heavy wash on everything to bring out the detailing. It's going to be inside, so it's not going to be that visible. Then I added LEDs using copper tape to light the interior and to add some warning lights on the outside. I'd left space for a false floor to hide all the wiring. I cut and drilled all the styrene until I can get the wires through. Finally, I glued on some acetate, and there's actually 2 layers to the control panel, and I glued the outer layer onto the inner layer, masking all of the joints on the acetate. I glued it in place at the top of the building and just neatened up all the edges with some trim. Before gluing the panels in place, I painted some orange stripes, added some stencils and put a number on. It's the same as the landing pad, K28, and also some meaningful stencils that just basically said all pilots must report on landing, and hopefully they know where to go if they want to recycle their rubbish. Then I laid them all out and hot glued them in place. Along the way for this project, I've designed a huge amount of accessories and details. So there's antenna and dishes for the top of the building. There's a monorail, a cargo gantry, pipe inlets that go into the side that allow some of the wires to run and add some detail. There's also from second Dynasty, who did the traveller ship, some cargo, some just people, crew, power suits, and some cargo loaders. Out of that pile, I made some stripped styrene into a base for the antenna and put something on the bottom of the satellite dish to stop it falling over. I painted the antenna red and then put a heavy enamel wash over everything just to darken it all down. I put red flashing LEDs on top of the antenna and pulled some magnet wire through to feed them power. The pipe inlets also got styrene bases, some of which have already been glued to the building and the rest of them I glued on now. I made the illuminated control tower display with clear styrene, etched with my Dremel, and then I put a little bit of diffusing material over 5 LEDs underneath and glued it in place. Finally, time to tone everything down, so I used the dirty glass enamel wash everywhere. I designed and made a ramp, printed it, spray primered it white, and then sprayed it with the aged iron so that it matched the rest of the landing pad. At this point, I realised I hadn't painted up the doors, so I did them on the ramp and I did the big external cargo doors too. Glued them in place and I was done on the building. Time for a backdrop. I had the bright idea to use an old 3D printer stepper motors and these Knex roller coasters to make a monorail and a cargo gantry. My cut-up roller coaster needed something to run on, so I designed and printed a monorail. It's a bit of a cheat, I know it's 2 rails, and I glued the Knex rail in between a top and a bottom that I 3D printed. These were sprayed with Desert Bisque. It's a textured Rust-Oleum spray paint. It's powered by a printer belt that runs in a groove in the back. The cargo gantry was also designed in Blender and 3D printed and glued together. Each section fits one piece of Knex track. I made a cover from strips of styrene, which helped hold it all together and added some much needed rigidity. Then I glued the track in place. I took the whole lot outside and sprayed it with black automotive paint. The actual section that moves, well, the first one was an unmitigated disaster. The resin was just flexible and warping worse every day. I reprinted an FDM which didn't hold the detail as well, but at least was dimensionally stable. I glued it all together, but I came back later and put the roller coaster wheels towards the ends. It just made it more stable. And then I painted it. First up, spray putty, fills in all the gaps. Then Tamiya grey primer. Then several coats of orange to get the density I needed, before adding a dark wash. This just brings out all the details. Now, I'd planned to put these in the backdrop building that we'll build in a minute, but, and it's a big but, they just didn't, I couldn't bear to tear it up once I built it. It took such a long time. So I designed and built these 2 towers from 3 and 5 mil PVC. This was really done on the fly, wasn't really planned, and at the end the electronics didn't fit, so I had to create a little bump out to go behind to put them in. Not my most fine modelling, and to make it look a little bit more detailed, I 3D printed some just squares with the corners knocked off, and I painted the whole lot with spray putty for the 3D prints and then with red oxide primer from Halford. It's a car spray. To make it all run, I used stepper motors from an old 3D printer and a new belt because I needed a long one, and I just jury-rigged it until it worked. It took me 8 attempts to get that holder to be the right size. I kid you not. Both the monorail and cargo gantry need a limit switch and end stop to basically turn them around and send them back across their tracks. And to get the wires from one side to the other, I decided to put these kids' play pipes at the bottom. It also adds a bit of rigidity because they're sort of securing the bottom of the towers and stopping them from splaying out. Finally, weathering, more dirty glass wash on the gantry, the pipes and the towers. Another piece of PVC board, another stenciled sign, 2 coats of white paint and some dirty glass wash. And finally, my spaceport had a name. Behind that is the backdrop building. This is made of 3cm black foam. I have to say it took me well over a day to work out all the angles. Each layer is different and they get slightly wider as they go up. But eventually I sussed it and ended up with 15 different layers of foam. I filled any unsightly gaps with Flex Bond, it's acrylic, and you can smooth it out with a bit of water on your finger. Then I painted even layers black and put a layer of gloss Mod Podge on. On the odd layers I mixed glue, just PVA glue, and tile grout, but when it dried it looked a little patchy, so I went over it with a tile grout and water mix like a paint. At last I was able to glue them all together, which I did with a mix of glues. I did hot glue to immediately tack them, but put some white glue in. If I try and get the whole length covered in hot glue, it's cold at one end before I put the other layer on, and then it doesn't sit properly. So just a few dabs, it's still warm and it hasn't melted the foam from being too hot. I used industrial city dirt pigment to give it some light weathering, then used PVA glue and Woodland Scenic's fine turf green blend to add some ferns. And now it was time to turn the lights on and make everything move. I've got to say, this was the worst part of the project. I'd taken an old 3D printer apart and I did use the stepper motors and limit switches, the end stops, but I could not get the main board to work and I spent a day or two trying. In the meanwhile, I soldered in some switches. These didn't work either because they were 12 volt LEDs and they were going to light up red, they were going to look really cool, but I couldn't work out how to get 12 volt on the ones that had to feed a 5 volt signal back to the Arduino. So I simplified it and went for some old-fashioned toggle switches that I found left over from an old model railway. Eventually I bought 2 stepper motor drivers and put them onto an Arduino, and finally it all worked. Then I just had to bring it all to life with a clutter. The ship comes with loads and loads of drive jump engines for the interior, which I didn't use because I did it in a smaller scale. So I repurposed them, plus used the second Dynasty cargo loaders and cargo. I painted them all, silver, yellow, black, whatever, and then put a heavy dark wash on them. The cargo container looks a bit mucky, so I just went over them again with a dry brush of a lighter grey. Add some streaking and a bit of detail. I printed a load of consoles from the ship for the control tower. I added a wash to the machinery, painted a couple of power suits to guard the ramp, and finished them off with an Army Painter red wash. I used electrical ducting to bridge the gap between the two buildings and also at the front of the building. Well weathered, of course, with dirty glass wash. Then I just had to arrange everything. I'd bought some repulsor barges from Imperial Terrain to put all the machinery outside on. I painted them exactly the same way as the cargo gantry, grey orange wash. So before the beauty shots, thank you to MyMiniFactory for sponsoring this video, and to Ben from Second Dynasty for designing such a great spaceship. If you're into Traveller, you want your Type S, or if you just want a cool spaceship you can play in, go check it out. It's crowdfunding now on MyMiniFactory. Oh, links down below. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe. I mean, you've got to the end, so you must have enjoyed it, right? Subscribe, hit the bell button. I'll see you next time. In the meanwhile, check out some of my other videos.